Greetings, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to Beyond the Second Cognition. I'm Endall Beall. On the heels of my discussion in the video, A Course in What? If you have listened to that video, then you got a lesson on interpretation, on how we see things one way, but how they are interpreted in a completely different fashion when you know a greater level of truth through which you can interpret the information correctly. The way your perceptions are controlled is achieved when people control a dialogue. This applies across the spectrum, whether it's political, cultural, or anything else. Whenever the public dialogue gets established, it sets up filters in our minds through which we pass information and then interpret the data according to these preconceived ideas. This is particularly hateful in the spiritual arena. What the hive did over the last 4,000 to 5,000 years, once it started intruding its mystical doctrines into human thinking, is it left seeds of comparative similarities. And what occurred with the Theosophists is they worked to achieve a homogenization of all of these religious and spiritual doctrines, trying to get to a climax of a hive takeover of this planet, which isn't going to occur. As they took all of these common seeds that threaded through occultism and Freemasonry and Rosicrucianism and Islam, the mystical traditions and Sufism, Wicca, witchcraft, fake Buddhism, Hinduism, and New Ageism. They took these seeds that were planted and they controlled the dialogue for thousands of years. So they set a level of impressions in people's minds. And when someone had an experience that goes beyond the norm, the only information that they had from which to interpret these experiences was through this controlled dialogue. You're talking to God, you're talking to the Creator, you're talking to Source. Nowhere within this realm did you have any other choice other than what was being spoon-fed to you through this controlled dialogue. As a result of this, you had filtering systems set up in your mind. And regardless of what kind of experience you had, whether it was through some type of hive, bogus, drug trip, epiphany, visionary situation, you always interpreted it based on these foundational filters because they controlled the dialogue. Now, if you had an experience that was generated by a Soika crew member, it would have been similar. But even then, you would have interpreted it through these same filters. And whenever you start from a faulty foundation, you wind up with a faulty conclusion. And this is what's happened with all these spiritual traditions, because they have controlled the dialogue. Everywhere you look, you see the same shit, because they have homogenized it for you to interpret it in a certain fashion. So when you have an experience, whether it's a real one or whether it's a fabricated one when the hive was active, you interpret all these experiences through the filters that they established by controlling the dialogue. This is how you have your perceptions controlled. You think that you're onto the truth and you're free, but when you go to look at the interpretive data, you find the same stuff everywhere. Oh, you may run it through a Jesus filter or a Muhammad filter or the Ascended Master filter or the Off-World Aliens filters, but it's all linked together through Theosophy and wrapped up in a nice little goulash in the New Age. So no matter where you look for an interpretation, when you have an odd beyond the five sense experience, you're met with the same data. So whatever experience you may have had gets run through this filter of the established dialogue. And so your conclusions are saying, oh, well, I must have been talking to an angel, or I must have been talking to an alien, or whatever the case may be, because they control the dialogue. And when they control the dialogue, they control what you know, and they establish your filters So whenever you have an experience, you interpret it the way they want you to interpret it, which follows along their doctrinal dictates. This same thing applies with politics. It applies in virtually every facet of your life. And this is how you control the perceptions of an entire planetary species. Break them down into cultures, and one culture's perceptions is different than another, but the culture is still the same. I wanted to lay this foundation because Gemma's going to be doing a follow-up video of some of her experiences. The problem we have is that we have no basis prior to what we're doing now to come up with a different interpretation than the stuff that the hive wanted you to believe. They wanted you to believe that angels were discarnate magical beings. Well, I got news for you, they weren't. They are as physical as you or I. They're not mystical, invisible, woo-woo beings floating around the throne of God on their wings. And this is part of the information we're going to be revealing in the new series of books. But people believe this stuff because they have been indoctrinated to it, because the dialogue has been controlled, and that's what they want you to believe. Everything has been tailored to create a sense of mysticism. When you're working with the second cognition, you are going to have experiences based on sensory perceptions and feelings. And I don't mean emotional feelings. I mean feelings like in your gut. You can't describe these feelings. All you can do is come close through allegory or metaphor, which we've used a lot in our books out of necessity because words simply fail. But they fail even more when we are bound to the impressions shoved down our throats by the hive and their mystical proponents throughout history, because they interpreted the shit the wrong way using the same mystical filters to reach their conclusions. When you have wrong filters, you have wrong answers. You always come up short. But when you default to the mystical, magical oneness doctrines of the hive, then you become chained to that ideology, regardless of which form it takes, whether it's the Catholic Church or the Protestants or whoever it may be. Every bit of mysticism or magical supernaturalism is contained in these doctrines, and they all thread together because it's all fabricated by the same shit. So everybody's impressions and everybody's interpretations are based on these pre-established dialogue-owned filters. Part of what I'm going to do when I write this Gutting Mysticism book is I'm going to go down there by item, and I'm going to show you the commonality in all of this stuff and how the hive controlled it. I'm going to use Hinduism, I'm going to use Christian mysticism, I'm going to use examples from Sufism, Baha'i, and all these other religions. I'm going to show you that it's the same shit wrapped in a different package. Occultism, all of it. And you can't come up with a viable answer because the only information you have available to you has been dictated to you, and they created your filters. In order to move into the second cognition, you're going to have to expand this filtering system and get away from what you've been told and start dealing with what you experience. This is just the first salvo of other information to come. But what I presented in that challenge of A Course in Miracles shows you how interpretation can totally screw up how you perceive a message. When your perceptions are controlled and the filtering mechanism is controlled, you're going to reach an outcome that is mandated and dictated by others. I hope everyone watches that video so they can get a lesson on interpretation, because interpretation is predicated on filters. When you have the wrong filters in place, you're going to get the wrong answers. You're going to get the wrong impressions. And you're not going to understand anything. I wanted to share this to advance some knowledge in reference to filtering and how you get your filtering and your interpretation mechanisms clouded and controlled by others. When they control the dialogue, they establish the filters. When you use their filters, you reach their conclusions. I want you all to ponder this very deeply because it's very important as you advance. You're going to have to be different and interpret different, and you can't use these old filters to reach your impressions and your conclusions. So for all of you doing the work, stay the course, and don't give up on yourselves.